Dr. Samuel Morrison's scalpel stopped mid-incision, his steady hands trembling for the first time in 20 years of surgery. The operating room fell silent, except for the rhythmic beep of monitors that would soon flatline. What they discovered beneath William Henderson's disfigured skull wasn't just tumor tissue. It was something that defied every medical textbook he'd ever studied. The surgical nurse gasped audibly, her metal instruments clattering to the sterile floor as she stepped backward. Two residents exchanged horrified glances through their masks, one gripping the observation rail until his knuckles turned white. In the hallway, Margaret Chen Henderson pressed her face against the OR window, watching her father's motionless form, remembering how he'd worn that same baseball cap to her medical school graduation 15 years ago. She'd been too ashamed then to introduce the man whose sacrifice had made it all possible. "Get pathology down here immediately," Morrison commanded, though his voice betrayed the uncertainty clawing at his chest. What had Bill Henderson carried in his skull for 4 decades? And why had he chosen to suffer in silence rather than seek help? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The story of William Bill Henderson began 40 years ago in the coal-dusted hollows of Harlan County, Kentucky, where men measured their worth in tons extracted and families survived on hope and stubbornness. Bill had worked the Henderson Mine Company for 35 years, his calloused hands and bent-back testament to a life spent in darkness, digging prosperity from the earth for others while barely scraping by himself. In 1987, when the mine's third shaft collapsed during the worst storm in county history, Bill Henderson became a hero without meaning to. While other miners fled the rumbling tunnels, he crawled back through the debris 3 times, pulling out Jimmy Walsh, young Tommy Crawford, and old Pete Morrison, Dr. Samuel Morrison's father. The falling timber that finally pinned Bill down also delivered the head injury that would change everything, though nobody knew it then. They just knew Bill Henderson had saved 3 lives and nearly lost his own. A year later, Bill and his wife Dorothy made a decision that surprised the entire county. They adopted 6-year-old Margaret Chen from a Vietnamese orphanage, a tiny girl with sad eyes who spoke no English and flinched whenever anyone raised their voice. Dot, an elementary school teacher with infinite patience, saw something in that frightened child that reminded her of the wounded animals she'd always nursed back to health. "Every soul deserves a chance to bloom," she'd tell Bill when neighbors whispered about the unusual family they were creating. By 1995, when the first small lumps appeared on Bill's scalp, Margaret was thriving. She'd become Maggie, a brilliant 13-year-old who devoured medical textbooks from the library and talked about becoming a doctor someday. The timing couldn't have been worse for Bill to discover something was growing beneath his thinning hair. Dot was already working 2 jobs to help save for Maggie's college fund, and the mine's insurance barely covered routine checkups, let alone mysterious growths that might require expensive specialists. So Bill Henderson made a choice that would define the next 4 decades of his life. He bought a larger baseball cap, grew his hair longer, and never spoke of the lumps that gradually multiplied and swelled. When concerned neighbors asked about his increasingly odd appearance, he'd tip his cap and say, "Just getting old, I reckon. Happens to the best of us." By 2010, when breast cancer claimed Dorothy after a brutal 2-year battle, Bill had sold their house, their car, and everything of value to pay for her treatments. He moved into a rusted, single-wide trailer on the outskirts of town, living on Social Security payments of $847 a month. The tumors had grown so large by then that even the biggest hat couldn't completely hide them, but Bill had perfected the art of avoiding mirrors and keeping his head down in public. Now, in December 2024, Dr. Margaret Chen Henderson was one of Boston's most respected cardiologists. while her father lived alone with secrets that had literally grown into the stuff of nightmares. The call came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday that would fracture Margaret Chen Henderson's carefully constructed world. She was reviewing cardiac catheterization results in her Boston office when her phone buzzed with a Kentucky area code she hadn't seen in 3 years. "Dr. Henderson, this is Gladys Thompson, your daddy's neighbor down in Harlan County." The voice was shaky, aged, carrying the weight of mountains and bad news. "Honey, I hate to be calling you this late, but your daddy, he collapsed at the Piggly Wiggly this evening. Paramedics said it looked real bad." Maggie's pen slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the mahogany desk her success had bought. 3 years. It had been 3 years since she'd seen Bill. 3 years since she'd made excuses about conference schedules and patient loads to avoid the guilt that lived in that Kentucky hollow. 3 years of sending Christmas cards with brief notes and checks he probably never cashed, telling herself she was too busy saving other people's fathers to visit her own. What happened exactly? Maggie managed, already reaching for her laptop to book the first flight south. "Well, he was just doing his weekly shopping, you know how he is. Always gets the same things on the same day." Mrs. Thompson's voice cracked. "But today he just dropped right there in aisle 4, next to the canned green beans. Made this awful sound like he was choking, and when we rolled him over—" The old woman paused, struggling. "Honey, I don't know how to say this gentle-like, but whatever's been growing on your daddy's head all these years, it's gotten powerful bad. The EMTs, they looked scared." The flight from Boston to Lexington stretched like purgatory. 6 hours for Maggie to replay every missed phone call, every declined invitation to visit, every time she'd chosen her career over the man who'd made it possible. She stared out the airplane window at clouds that looked like the cotton fields Dot used to describe from her Alabama childhood, remembering how her adoptive mother would stroke her hair and promise that families weren't just born. They were built with daily choices to love and stay and show up. Choices Maggie had stopped making somewhere along the way. The University of Kentucky Medical Center loomed like a judgment against the December sky, all glass and steel efficiency that reminded Maggie too much of her own hospital in Boston. She found Bill in room 314, and the sight of him stopped her cold in the doorway. The baseball cap that had been his signature for as long as she could remember sat oversized on his head, but it couldn't hide what had happened to his face and neck. Massive, irregular growths covered nearly 60% of his visible skin, some the size of golf balls, others flowing together in grotesque landscapes that made her doctor's training war with her daughter's horror. "Hey there, sweetheart." Bill's voice was exactly the same. Warm honey over gravel, the sound of Sunday mornings and bedtime stories and unconditional love. "Don't you worry about your old man. Just a little bump on the noggin, nothing that'll keep me down long." Maggie approached his bed like she was walking through quicksand, each step heavier than the last. Up close, she could see how the tumors had distorted his features, pulling his right eye slightly closed and twisting his mouth into a permanent half-smile. But his eyes, those were still her daddy's eyes, still bright with the kind of love that had convinced a scared 6-year-old Vietnamese orphan that she belonged in Kentucky coal country. "Daddy, how long—" She couldn't finish the question, couldn't reconcile the man in this bed with the strong miner who'd taught her to throw curveballs and conjugate irregular verbs. "Oh, this old mess?" Bill gestured vaguely at his face with hands that shook slightly. "Been developing for a while now. You know how these things go. Little bit here, little bit there. Nothing worth troubling you about, what with your important work and all." Dr. Samuel Morrison chose that moment to enter, a tall man with kind eyes and the bearing of someone who'd delivered difficult news too many times. "Ms. Chen Henderson, I'm Dr. Morrison, neurosurgery. I've been reviewing your father's scans, and I need to speak with you privately." In the hallway, Morrison's professional composure cracked slightly. "Ma'am, I've been practicing medicine for 20 years, and I've never seen anything quite like your father's condition. The growths appear to be some form of neurofibromatosis, but the size and progression— How long has he been living with this untreated?" "I don't know," Maggie whispered, the admission burning her throat. I haven't been home in 3 years." Morrison studied her face with the careful attention of a man who'd learned to read family dynamics in hospital corridors. "Ma'am, your father is going to need immediate surgical intervention. These tumors are putting pressure on his brainstem. Without surgery, he has maybe weeks, possibly days." The world tilted sideways, and Maggie gripped the wall for support. "What do you need from me?" The financial reality hit Maggie like a physical blow the next morning. Dr. Morrison sat across from her in the hospital's sterile consultation room, a manila folder thick with estimates and insurance forms spread between them like evidence of a crime she hadn't yet committed. "The surgery alone will run approximately $400,000, Morrison said quietly, his pen tracing numbers that might as well have been written in blood. "Post-operative care, rehabilitation, potential complications— we're looking at somewhere between $700,000 and $850,000 total." Maggie stared at the papers, her medical training automatically calculating medication dosages and recovery timelines, while her daughter's heart screamed at the impossibility of it all. "His insurance?" "Your father doesn't have insurance, Miss Chen Henderson. He's been living on Social Security disability since the mine closed." $847 a month. Morrison's voice carried the weight of too many families destroyed by American healthcare economics. "I'm sorry, but without payment guarantees or coverage verification, the hospital board won't approve the procedure." The ride to Bill's trailer took her through neighborhoods that time had forgotten, past boarded-up storefronts and houses held together by hope and duct tape. Harlan County looked like a place where dreams came to die, and Maggie suddenly understood why she'd stayed away so long. Coming back meant confronting the poverty she'd escaped, the life her success was supposed to have lifted her family out of. Bill's single-wide trailer sat at the end of a gravel road that probably flooded every spring, surrounded by the rusted skeletons of cars that would never run again. Inside, the contrast between her Boston penthouse and her father's reality was overwhelming. The furniture was older than she was, held together with Afghans Dot had crocheted before cancer took her fingers' steadiness. The refrigerator hummed like it was dying, and the space heater in the corner worked overtime against December's bite. But it was clean, painfully, meticulously clean, the way people keep things when they don't have much but refuse to let go of dignity. Maggie found Bill's financial records in a shoebox beneath his bed, bank statements showing the monthly Social Security deposit, utility bills paid to the penny, and a small notebook where he'd tracked every expense in careful handwriting. Groceries, $127, medicine, $43, gas for truck, $38. At the bottom of each month's page he'd written the same thing: "Grateful for what I have." The discovery that broke her came in a manila envelope tucked behind his dresser mirror. 15 years of Christmas cards, every single one she'd sent, still unopened in their envelopes. Her name and address written in her own handwriting year after year, but never opened. At first she thought it was anger, rejection, punishment for her absence. Then she found the reading glasses with the thick lenses sitting on his bedside table next to a Bible with print so large it looked like a children's book. He couldn't read. Her brilliant, sacrificing father had never learned to read well enough to open his daughter's cards. Mrs. Gladys Thompson knocked on the door as Maggie sat sobbing over the unopened cards. The elderly woman took one look at Maggie's face and pulled her into arms that smelled like flour and Old Spice, the same cologne Dot used to wear. "He sold the house in 2009, Mrs. Thompson said without preamble, settling into Bill's recliner like she'd done it 1,000 times before. Your mama's cancer treatments weren't covered, you know. That fancy clinic in Louisville where they tried that experimental therapy. Bill sold everything. The house your mama loved, his truck, even her wedding ring. Used every penny trying to save her. Maggie looked around the trailer with new eyes, seeing not poverty, but love distilled to its essence. Why didn't he tell me? I could have helped. I was already practicing in Boston. Child, your daddy's pride runs deeper than the coal veins in these hills. He knew you were building something important up there, knew your mama would roll over in her grave if he pulled you back into this struggle. Mrs. Thompson's voice carried 40 years of watching Bill Henderson sacrifice himself for others. Besides, he figured you had enough on your plate with your own life. Didn't want to be what he called a burden on your success. That afternoon, Maggie sat in her rental car outside the hospital and made a decision that would either save her father's life or destroy her career. She pulled out her phone and called her friend Jennifer at Massachusetts General, the one favor she'd been saving for years. "Jen, I need you to do something for me, no questions asked. I need you to submit insurance pre-authorization paperwork for a patient transfer from Kentucky to Boston, neurological surgery, complex case." Maggie's voice was steady, professional, even as her hands shook. "Patient name is William Henderson, insurance carrier, Blue Cross Blue Shield Federal Employee Plan." "Maggie, you don't have BCBS Federal. You have the hospital's private plan." "I know what I have, Jen. Just, please, trust me on this one." The silence stretched between them, filled with years of friendship and the weight of what Maggie was asking. Medical insurance fraud was a federal crime. If caught, she'd lose her license, face prison time, and destroy everything she'd built. But watching her father try to smile through tumors that were killing him while worrying about being a financial burden had clarified something essential about what really mattered. "How complex are we talking?" Jennifer finally asked. "The kind that makes neurosurgeons cry," Maggie whispered. "I'll submit the paperwork tonight. Transfer can happen day after tomorrow, if approved." "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. And Maggie, whatever you're planning, be careful. Some bridges, once you burn them, you can never cross again." Maggie hung up and sat in the parking lot as Kentucky winter settled around her like a judgment. She was about to risk everything she'd worked for, everything Dot and Bill had sacrificed to give her. But for the first time in 3 years, she felt like she was finally coming home. The days following Bill's insurance approval moved with the surreal quality of a dream balanced on the edge of becoming a nightmare. Maggie had taken temporary leave from her Boston practice, officially citing family medical emergency, while privately knowing she might never return to the prestigious position she'd spent decades building. The fraudulent insurance claim sat like a ticking bomb in her conscience, but watching her father shuffle around his trailer, trying to hide the increasing pain from growths that were clearly affecting his vision and mobility, made the risk feel not just justified but inevitable. Dr. Morrison had scheduled the surgery for December 23rd, giving them 5 days to prepare for what he privately told Maggie might be the most complex neurological procedure he'd ever attempted. The imaging studies revealed a nightmare of interconnected tumor masses that had grown not just on Bill's skull, but had sent tendrils deep into his brain tissue, wrapping around critical blood vessels and nerves like invasive vines, choking the life from a tree. During those 5 days, Maggie discovered the true scope of her father's sacrifice through a series of revelations that rewrote everything she thought she knew about their family history. The first came when she found a shoebox under his bed containing every paycheck stub from his final 20 years at the mine, each one showing double and triple overtime hours that explained how a coal miner's salary had somehow stretched to cover medical school tuition for an adopted daughter. The second revelation came from Mrs. Thompson, who arrived Tuesday morning with a casserole and the kind of determined expression that meant she had important information to share. "Your daddy made me promise never to tell you this while he was alive and kicking," she said, settling into Bill's worn recliner with the authority of someone who'd been keeping neighborhood secrets for decades. "But, seeing as how he might not make it through this surgery, I figure promises to dying men need some flexibility." Maggie looked up from the medical journals she'd been reading, preparing mentally for the surgical procedure she'd be assisting with. "What kind of promise, Mrs. Thompson?" "About your graduation from medical school. You remember how your daddy couldn't make it? Said he had the flu?" Mrs. Thompson's weathered hands smoothed her floral dress with nervous energy. "Well, that was a lie, honey. He was there. Sat in the very back row, wore his best suit, the one he bought for your mama's funeral, and cried like a baby when they called your name." The medical journal slipped from Maggie's fingers. "He was there, drove 14 hours each way, slept in his truck in the parking lot because he couldn't afford a hotel, but he didn't want you to see him and feel obligated to introduce him to your fancy friends. Said he looked too much like what he was, a coal miner who didn't belong in that kind of company." Mrs. Thompson's voice carried 40 years of watching Bill Henderson sacrifice his pride along with everything else for his daughter's success. He had pictures, though. Took about 50 of them from way back there, fuzzy as they were. Still keeps them in his dresser drawer. Maggie found the photographs that afternoon, tucked behind a mirror in Bill's bedroom. Blurry images shot from the back of a graduation auditorium, showing a tiny figure in cap and gown that was barely recognizable as herself. But they were carefully preserved in a manila envelope labeled, "My beautiful daughter, Dr. Margaret Henderson," in Bill's careful handwriting. The third revelation came Wednesday evening, when Dr. Morrison called with results from the specialized imaging studies that would guide the surgical approach. His voice carried the careful neutrality that meant bad news delivered with professional gentleness. "Maggie, we need to discuss something unusual about your father's scans. The tumor growth patterns don't match anything in the medical literature. It's almost as if these masses formed around foreign objects, something that's been in his system for decades." Morrison paused, and Maggie could hear him reviewing films in the background. "I need to ask you directly. Is there any chance your father was exposed to unusual materials during his mining work? Radioactive substances, heavy metals, anything that might explain what we're seeing?" Maggie stared at her father, who was pretending to watch television while obviously listening to her phone conversation. His expression had gone carefully blank in the way it did when conversations touched on subjects he preferred to avoid. "Dr. Morrison, let me ask him directly and call you back." The conversation that followed would haunt Maggie for the rest of her life. Bill's initial denials crumbled under her gentle but persistent questioning, until finally he asked her to sit down and prepared to share a secret he'd carried for 37 years. "You remember the mine collapse in '87? The one where I got hurt pulling out Jimmy Walsh and them other boys?" Bill's voice was quiet, measured, like someone confessing sins to a priest. "Well, there's more to that story than what made the papers." He explained about the geological formation they'd been cutting through, about the company's knowledge of diamond-bearing ore that they'd never disclosed to the miners. He told her about the moments before the collapse, when he'd realized the glittering stones embedded in the coal face weren't just quartz crystals. "I knew that mine was going to close soon. Company was already talking about shutdowns, layoffs. Your mama and me, we'd just decided to adopt you, and I was looking at your little face in that photograph from the orphanage, thinking about how we were going to pay for everything you'd need." Bill's hands shook as he spoke, whether from the tumors pressing on his nervous system or from the weight of confession. Maggie couldn't tell. So when I saw them diamonds, when I realized what they were, I made a decision that probably saved your life and definitely changed mine. The decision had been to swallow as many stones as he could manage in the moments before the timber came down. 47 pieces of raw diamond ore, ranging from pebble size to marble size, ingested in desperate hope and carried in his body for nearly 4 decades while they slowly worked their way through his system, becoming encapsulated in scar tissue and tumor growth as his body tried to protect itself from the foreign objects. Most of them passed through natural-like over the first few years, Bill explained with the matter-of-fact tone he'd always used for practical problems. But some got stuck, lodged up in my digestive tract, then worked their way higher as things shifted around inside. By the time they started causing real problems, you were in high school, talking about medical school and having dreams I wasn't going to let anything destroy. Maggie sat in stunned silence, trying to process the revelation that her father had literally carried her future in his body, enduring decades of disfigurement rather than risk losing the financial security he'd stolen for her education. "Daddy, why didn't you ever tell me? Even 1 or 2 of those stones could have paid for surgery years ago, and risk losing all of them to some doctor or hospital that might ask too many questions." Bill shook his head with the stubborn logic that had guided 4 decades of decision-making. Besides, as long as they were in my body, they belonged to me fair and square. The minute I took them out, they became evidence of theft. Thursday brought the community fundraiser that Mrs. Thompson had organized, transforming the basement of Harlan County Baptist Church into a testament to the way small communities rally around their own. The event raised $23,000, a significant sum for a struggling rural area, but still far short of the surgical costs that insurance was supposedly covering. Maggie watched her father work the room, accepting hugs and well-wishes from people who'd known him since childhood, many of whom he'd worked alongside in the mines. Jimmy Walsh, now 65 and walking with a cane from his own mining injuries, stood to address the crowd with words that captured something essential about Bill Henderson's character. "Most of you know Bill saved my life in that mine collapse 37 years ago. What you don't know is that he also saved my family's financial future. See, I was the one supposed to be working that section where the worst damage happened. Bill switched shifts with me that week because my oldest boy had pneumonia, and I needed to stay close to home." Jimmy's voice carried the weight of a debt that could never be fully repaid. "Bill Henderson has spent his whole life putting other people first, and it's about time we returned the favor." The final revelation came Friday morning when Maggie was helping her father organize his personal effects before the surgery. In a coffee can hidden behind the water heater, she found $9,000 in cash, $50 bills saved from his monthly Social Security payments over 15 years. "Emergency fund," Bill explained sheepishly when she confronted him about it. "Figured if something ever happened to me, you'd need money for burial expenses and such. Didn't want to be a financial burden even in death." $9,000. Her father, living on $847 a month, had somehow managed to save $50 every month for 15 years while enduring medical problems that would have driven most people to suicide. The mathematics of his sacrifice were as staggering as they were heartbreaking. That evening, as they sat together on the trailer's small porch, watching Kentucky winter settle over the mountains that had shaped both their lives, Maggie finally found words for the gratitude and guilt that had been building since her arrival. "I'm sorry I stayed away so long. I'm sorry I was so busy building a career on your sacrifice that I forgot to come home and say thank you." Bill reached over and took her hand with fingers that still bore the calluses of 35 years in the mines. "Sweetheart, your success is my thank you. Every patient you've saved, every life you've made better, that's what made all this worthwhile. You think I regret looking like a monster for 40 years if it meant you became the kind of doctor who saves lives?" As they prepared for surgery the next morning, both father and daughter understood they were facing more than a medical procedure. They were confronting 4 decades of sacrifice, love, and hidden truths that had shaped their relationship in ways neither had fully understood until now. The diamonds were still there, embedded in Bill's body like crystallized hope, waiting to be discovered by surgeons who had no idea they were about to uncover one of the most extraordinary love stories in medical history. December 23rd arrived like a reckoning, wrapped in the clinical fluorescence of pre-dawn operating rooms and the weight of decisions that couldn't be undone. At 4:30 a.m., Dr. Samuel Morrison stood outside OR 7, reviewing scans that defied his 20 years of neurosurgical experience, while Maggie paced the hallway in scrubs she'd borrowed from the cardiac unit. The insurance approval had come through 36 hours earlier, a miracle of bureaucratic efficiency that had surprised everyone except Maggie, who knew exactly why the paperwork had sailed through federal channels without a hitch. Now, as Bill was wheeled toward what might be his final conscious moments, the weight of her deception pressed against her chest like a physical thing. "Daddy," she whispered, squeezing his hand as the gurney paused outside the operating room doors. Bill's eyes, still bright despite the morphine coursing through his system, focused on her face with the same love that had welcomed a frightened Vietnamese orphan 37 years ago. "Don't you look so worried, sweetheart. Your old man's tougher than a $2 steak." His voice was slurred but steady, carrying the familiar humor he'd used to deflect fear since she was small. "Besides, I got the best surgical team in Kentucky looking after me, and my daughter standing guard. What more could a fellow ask for?" Maggie kissed his forehead, tasting the antiseptic soap they'd used to clean around the tumors. "I'll be right here when you wake up. I promise." "I know you will, little bird. You always keep your promises." Bill's eyes drifted closed as the anesthesia took hold, and Maggie watched her father disappear into chemical sleep, wondering if she'd ever hear his voice again. "Doctor." Morrison emerged from the scrub room 15 minutes later, his face set in the focused calm that preceded major surgery. "Dr. Chen Henderson, I need to ask you one more time. Are you sure you want to scrub in on this? Operating on family members violates about 6 different medical ethics guidelines." "He's my father," Maggie said simply, already moving toward the sinks. "I've assisted on enough cardiac surgeries to be useful, and if something goes wrong—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but Morrison understood. Some risks were worth taking when love outweighed protocol. The operating room felt like a cathedral of medical technology, monitors beeping in electronic harmony, while spotlights illuminated Bill's still form like a religious offering. Maggie took her position across from Morrison, her hands steady despite the chaos in her heart. She'd performed surgery hundreds of times, but never on someone whose bedtime stories had shaped her childhood, whose sacrifice had built her career. "Beginning first incision," Morrison announced to the surgical team at 6:12 a.m. The scalpel moved with practiced precision, parting skin that hadn't seen sunlight in decades. What they found beneath the surface defied every medical textbook Maggie had ever studied. The tumors weren't simply growing on Bill's skull. They had integrated with the bone itself, creating a grotesque fusion of diseased tissue and calcified growth that pulsed with its own blood supply. Worse, the largest mass had extended tendrils deep into the brain tissue, wrapping around the brain stem like parasitic vines. "Jesus Christ," whispered Dr. Patel, the anesthesiologist, monitoring Bill's vitals with increasing concern. His blood pressure's dropping fast. "We're losing him." Morrison's hands moved with surgical ballet, his scalpel dancing between life and death as he worked to separate tumor from essential brain tissue. Maggie assisted, her cardiac training invaluable as she monitored her father's heart function while watching decades of hidden suffering exposed under surgical lights. 3 hours into the procedure, they encountered the first mystery. As Morrison carefully extracted a golf ball-sized tumor from behind Bill's left ear, something hard clinked against the surgical tray, something that definitely wasn't organic tissue. "What the hell is that?" Morrison muttered, using forceps to extract what appeared to be a small, irregularly shaped stone. It was roughly the size of a marble, translucent with an inner fire that caught the operating room lights and threw them back in rainbow fragments. "Is that—" Maggie leaned closer, her medical training warring with recognition that made no sense. The object looked like raw diamond ore, the kind of geological formation that had no business being inside a human skull. "We'll analyze it later," Morrison decided, dropping the stone into a specimen container. "Right now, your father needs our full attention." But the mysteries multiplied as they worked deeper into the tumor mass. More stones emerged, 17 in total from the first major tumor alone, each one carefully extracted and preserved while Morrison fought to save Bill's life. The largest piece, extracted from the primary growth that had been pressing against his brainstem, was the size of a shooter marble and blazed with an inner light that seemed impossible. By hour 8, both surgeons were exhausted, their scrubs soaked with perspiration despite the cool operating room temperature. Bill had flatlined twice, each time brought back by Maggie's desperate cardiac massage and Morrison's refusal to accept defeat. The tumor removal was proving more complex than anyone had anticipated. What should have been a 12-hour surgery was stretching toward 15 hours as they discovered growth patterns that defied medical logic. "His pressure's dropping again," Dr. Patel announced, his voice tight with concern. "We're losing him." Maggie watched the monitors showing her father's life slipping away in real time, the steady beep, beep, beep deteriorating into the erratic rhythm that preceded cardiac arrest. Without thinking, she moved to the head of the table, taking over chest compressions while Morrison continued the delicate brain surgery. "Come on, Daddy," she whispered, pumping his heart with her hands while tears she couldn't afford to shed blurred her vision. "You don't get to leave me now, not after everything, not when I finally came home." The flatline alarm screamed through the operating room, a sound that had haunted Maggie's nightmares since medical school. Bill's heart had stopped, his brain waves flatlining on the monitors as the surgical team fought to bring him back from whatever dark place souls go when bodies fail. "Charging paddles," Morrison called out, stepping back from the brain surgery to help with resuscitation. "Clear." The defibrillator shock lifted Bill's body off the table, but the monitors remained flatly silent. Maggie resumed chest compressions, pressing her palms against the ribs that had once lifted her toward bedroom ceilings during games of airplane, now fragile beneath her desperate hands. "Come back," she commanded, her voice breaking with 40 years of unsaid words. "Come back to me, you stubborn old mountain man. You don't get to quit on me now." For 3 minutes and 17 seconds, an eternity in surgical time, Bill Henderson was clinically dead. His heart silent, his brain waves flat, his body still except for the artificial rhythm of his daughter's compressions. The surgical team worked with the desperate efficiency of people who'd seen too many families destroyed by loss, pumping medications and shocking his heart, and refusing to accept what the monitors insisted was inevitable. Then, like a miracle wrapped in medical science, the heart monitor showed a single blip, then another, then the steady rhythm that meant life, consciousness, hope. "We've got him back," Dr. Patel announced, his voice shaky with relief. "Sinus rhythm, pressure stabilizing." Morrison immediately returned to the brain surgery, working now with the urgency of borrowed time. The remaining tumor tissue came away in chunks, each piece carefully examined for more of the mysterious stones that had been growing inside Bill's skull for decades. By the time the final suture was placed, They had extracted 47 individual stones of varying sizes, creating a collection that sparkled like captured starlight in the specimen containers. "Surgery complete," Morrison announced at 11:43 p.m., nearly 18 hours after they'd begun. "Patient stable, vitals strong. Whatever the hell those things were in his head, they're out now." Maggie stayed beside Bill's bed in the ICU, holding his hand while machines monitored every heartbeat, every breath, every sign that her father was still fighting his way back to consciousness. The stones sat in containers on the nearby table, awaiting analysis that would answer questions none of them knew how to ask. As Christmas Eve arrived with snow falling against the hospital windows, Maggie whispered the words she should have said years ago. "I'm here, Daddy. I'm finally here, and I'm never leaving again." Christmas Eve dawned gray and merciless, bringing with it the kind of complications that transform medical miracles into family tragedies. Bill remained unconscious 18 hours post-surgery, his body fighting an infection that had taken root during the marathon procedure. Dr. Morrison delivered the news with the careful precision of a man who'd learned to break hearts gently. "The surgery was successful in removing the tumors, but your father's immune system is severely compromised. 40 years of untreated growth put tremendous strain on his body." Morrison sat across from Maggie in the family consultation room, his surgical scrubs replaced with the rumpled clothes of a doctor who hadn't left the hospital since yesterday. "We're looking at a 30% survival rate, maybe less given his age and the trauma his system has endured." Maggie stared at the clinical language that reduced her father's life to statistics and percentages. 30%. The same odds she'd have given a cardiac patient with massive arterial blockage and multiple comorbidities. Professional detachment crumbled when the patient was the man who'd taught her to believe in impossible things. The infection news was devastating enough, but it was only the beginning of Christmas Eve's cruelties. At 10:47 a.m., Maggie's phone rang with a number she recognized from Boston, the Massachusetts Board of Registration in Medicine. Her stomach dropped before she even answered. "Dr. Chen Henderson, this is Director Patricia Walsh. We need to discuss some irregularities that have come to our attention regarding insurance claims filed under your physician identification number." The voice was professionally neutral, the tone of someone delivering career-ending news without emotion. Specifically, claims for a William Henderson at University of Kentucky Medical Center for Neurological Surgery totaling $847,000. Maggie closed her eyes, feeling the walls of her carefully constructed life collapsing around her. "I understand you need to investigate." "Dr. Chen Henderson, federal insurance fraud is not an investigation matter. It's a criminal matter. The FBI will be contacting you shortly, and your medical license is hereby suspended pending a full review." The line went dead, leaving Maggie alone with the sound of her career dying in a hospital hallway. By noon, the media had arrived. Someone had leaked the story, "Prominent Boston cardiologist commits insurance fraud to save father," and news vans lined the hospital parking lot like vultures. Maggie watched from Bill's ICU window as reporters set up cameras, their presence transforming her family's private tragedy into public entertainment. The first news segment aired at 1 p.m. on the waiting room television, and Maggie stood frozen as her professional headshot appeared next to headlines that reduced 30 years of medical service to a criminal act. "Boston doctor faces federal charges for insurance fraud," the anchor announced with practiced sympathy. Dr. Margaret Chen Henderson allegedly falsified federal insurance documents to pay for her father's surgery, risking 5 years in federal prison. Dr. Morrison found her in the family restroom 20 minutes later, sobbing over the sink while trying to wash away mascara that had run like black tears down her cheeks. He handed her paper towels without speaking, his presence an anchor of calm in the storm of her unraveling life. "They suspended my license," she whispered. 25 years of practice gone. And for what? He might not even wake up. Your father is going to wake up, Morrison said with quiet certainty. And when he does, he's going to be proud as hell that his daughter risked everything to save him. That's what love looks like, Dr. Henderson. Messy, complicated, and worth every sacrifice. The afternoon brought worse news. Hospital administration, spooked by the media attention and federal investigation, ordered Bill's transfer to the county medical facility, a place where understaffed units and underfunded care sent patients to die with dignity but little hope. The transfer was scheduled for 6:00 p.m., giving Maggie barely enough time to arrange private care she couldn't afford. We can't guarantee his level of care will continue at the county facility, Dr. Morrison admitted, his professional obligations warring with his personal investment in Bill's case. Their ICU is limited, and with his current infection status. The implication hung between them like a death sentence. County medical was where poor people went to die, not where miracle recoveries happened. Bill's 30% survival chance would drop to near zero without the intensive monitoring and immediate intervention capabilities of the university hospital. At 4:30 p.m., as Maggie sat holding her unconscious father's hand and calculating how to liquidate her Boston assets fast enough to pay for private medical care, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Saw the news. Check your email. J. Jennifer's email contained a single line. Wire transfer confirmation, $75,000 to UK Medical Center account. Merry Christmas and don't you dare try to pay me back. More emails followed throughout the afternoon. Dr. Patricia Williams from Mass General. Private consultation fund contribution, $15,000. Dr. Michael Torres from her residency program. Emergency medical fund, $8,500. Dr. Sarah Kim, whom she'd mentored through fellowship, for Mr. Henderson, $12,000. Her colleagues, doctors who understood that insurance companies sometimes forced good people into impossible choices, were quietly funding her father's care. Not enough to solve everything, but enough to keep him in the ICU through the critical period. The transfer order was rescinded at 5:47 p.m., 13 minutes before the ambulance was scheduled to arrive. But victory felt hollow when balanced against the infection spreading through Bill's bloodstream and the federal charges that would likely end her career regardless of her father's outcome. Christmas Eve. Visiting hours extended until midnight, a small mercy that allowed Maggie to maintain her vigil as snow fell outside the ICU windows. Bill's condition had stabilized but not improved. His fever hovering at 102 degrees, his breathing supported by machines, his brain activity registering on monitors but not translating to consciousness. At 11:30 p.m., alone except for the night nurse who checked vitals every hour, Maggie finally allowed herself to break completely. She laid her head on her father's chest, listening to the heartbeat she'd restarted with her own hands, and whispered the words she'd carried for 3 years. I'm sorry I stayed away so long. I'm sorry I was too proud to come home, too afraid of seeing what my success had cost you. I'm sorry you suffered alone while I built a career on the foundation of your sacrifice. Her tears fell onto the hospital gown that couldn't hide how thin he'd become, how the tumors had stolen not just his appearance but his strength. I'm sorry I let my shame keep me from telling you how much I love you, how grateful I am for every bedtime story and scraped knee bandage and college tuition payment you somehow managed on a coal miner's salary. The monitors continued their electronic lullaby, marking time in a space between life and death where families learned the true cost of love. Outside, Christmas arrived with silent snow and empty promises, while inside the ICU, a daughter held vigil over the father whose hidden diamonds might have saved them both, if only she'd been brave enough to come home before it was almost too late. Bill's fever spiked to 104 degrees at 11:58 p.m., setting off alarms that brought the night medical team running. As Christmas Day began with emergency procedures and desperate measures, Maggie realized that all the money and medical expertise in the world might not be enough to undo 40 years of silent suffering. Some stones, once embedded in the heart, were harder to extract than others. Christmas morning arrived with the soft chiming of ICU monitors and the miracle of Bill Henderson's eyes opening for the first time in 36 hours. Maggie had fallen asleep in the bedside chair, her hands still wrapped around his fingers, when his voice, weak but unmistakably warm, pulled her back to consciousness. "Maggie, my beautiful girl, is that really you?" She jerked awake, hardly daring to believe what she was seeing. Bill's eyes, clear and focused despite the medications, were studying her face with the same wonder she remembered from childhood mornings when he'd pretend to be surprised that she'd grown taller overnight. "Daddy," the word came out as half laugh, half sob. "You're awake. You're really awake." Bill tried to lift his hand to touch her face, but the IV lines and monitoring cables restricted his movement. Instead, he settled for squeezing her fingers with surprising strength. "Course I'm awake. Couldn't very well sleep through Christmas morning with my daughter here, could I?" Dr. Morrison arrived within minutes of the nurse's call, his usually composed demeanor cracking into something approaching joy as he performed the neurological assessments that confirmed what they all hoped but hardly dared believe. Bill's brain function appeared completely normal despite the marathon surgery and life-threatening infection. "Mr. Henderson, can you tell me your full name and where you are?" "William Robert Henderson, and I'm in a hospital that's costing my daughter more money than I made in 20 years of mining." Bill's attempt at humor was undermined by the tubes running down his throat, but his wit was clearly intact. "Though I suspect that fancy surgery of yours found more than just tumors up there in my head." Morrison exchanged glances with Maggie, both of them remembering the mysterious stones that now sat in laboratory containers awaiting analysis. "We did find some unusual mineral deposits, Mr. Henderson. Perhaps you could help us understand how they got there?" For the first time since awakening, Bill's expression grew serious. He looked at Maggie with eyes that carried decades of secrets, and she could see him weighing how much truth a Christmas morning could bear. "Daddy, whatever it is, just tell us. We've come this far together." Bill closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, Maggie saw the same expression he'd worn when explaining why her mother wasn't coming home from the hospital, the look of a man preparing to share a burden he'd carried alone too long. 1987, third shaft collapse at Henderson Mine. You remember that storm, Maggie? Rain for 6 days straight, flooding everything from here to Harlan proper. Bill's voice grew stronger as the story emerged, as if speaking the truth after 37 years was its own form of healing. "When that timber came down and trapped me, I wasn't just trying to get out. I was trying to get something out with me." He paused, gathering strength for revelations that would rewrite everything Maggie thought she knew about their family's history. "See, that section of the mine where the collapse happened, it wasn't regular coal seam. Company knew it, but they never told us workers. We'd been cutting through a geological formation that contained diamond-bearing ore. Not the fancy jewelry kind, but rough stones that could be worth something if a man knew how to get them appraised." Maggie felt her medical training trying to process information that made no sense. "Daddy, are you saying you swallowed diamonds?" 47 of them by my count, ranging from pebble size up to one piece about big as a marble." Bill's confession came with the matter-of-fact tone he'd always used for practical discussions about money and survival. "Figured if I was going to die in that mine anyway, might as well die trying to secure my family's future. But when they pulled me out alive, well, I couldn't exactly spit them up in front of the rescue crew." Dr. Morrison was staring at Bill with the expression of a man whose medical textbooks had just become obsolete. "Mr. Henderson, human digestive systems don't typically retain foreign objects for decades. How did these stones remain in your system for 37 years? Body's a funny thing, Doc. Most of them passed through normal-like over the first few years, but some got stuck. Lodged up somewhere behind my stomach, I figured. Started causing problems around 1995, pain, swelling, headaches. But by then, Maggie was in high school, talking about college and medical school." Bill's eyes found Maggie's face, soft with memory and regret. "Couldn't very well tell my brilliant daughter that her daddy had stolen diamonds rattling around in his gut." The truth was simultaneously more mundane and more extraordinary than anything Maggie had imagined. No mysterious medical condition, no rare genetic disorder, just a desperate father's attempt to provide for his family, carried in his body for 4 decades while it slowly grew into the grotesque tumors that had defined the last half of his life. "The stones migrated over time," Morrison mused, his scientific mind already working through the physiological implications. "Worked their way up through your digestive tract, eventually becoming embedded in the soft tissue of your neck and scalp. Your body encapsulated them with scar tissue and tumor growth as a protective response." "Like oysters making pearls," Bill said with a weak smile. "Except my pearls were ugly as sin and hurt like the devil." Maggie was struggling to process the revelation that her father had literally carried her future in his body, enduring decades of disfigurement rather than risk losing the financial security he'd stolen for her education. "Daddy, why didn't you ever have them removed? Even 1 or 2 stones could have paid for the surgery." "And risk losing all of them to some doctor or hospital that might ask too many questions about where they came from." Bill shook his head. "Besides, I figured as long as they were in my body, they belonged to me fair and square. The minute I took them out, they became stolen property again." The laboratory results arrived that afternoon, delivered by Dr. Elizabeth Santos, the hospital's geology consultant who'd been called in to analyze the unusual specimens. Her report read like something from a treasure hunter's dream. 47 pieces of raw diamond ore, ranging from 0.3 to 2.7 carats in rough weight, with an estimated combined value, pending professional cutting and appraisal, of approximately $1.2 million. Maggie stared at the numbers until they blurred, trying to reconcile the magnitude of what her father had carried in silence. Enough money to pay for his surgery 10 times over, enough to secure both their futures, to fund the family clinic she'd dreamed of opening, to transform their lives in ways she'd never imagined possible. "Mr. Henderson," Dr. Santos explained, "these are extremely rare Kentucky diamonds, formed in geological conditions that haven't existed in this region for millions of years." The Henderson mine was actually sitting on one of the richest diamond deposits ever discovered in North America, but the company never disclosed it because they were contracted for coal extraction only. Bill listened to the technical explanation with the patient attention of a man who'd learned important information usually came wrapped in words he didn't understand. "So what you're telling me, Doc, is that I spent 37 years looking like a monster because I was carrying around more money than I ever dreamed of having?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you, Mr. Henderson. Your sacrifice wasn't just emotional. It was literally worth millions." That evening, as Christmas Day faded into memory and Bill's condition continued to improve, Maggie received a call from Boston that changed everything. Jennifer's voice was breathless with excitement and disbelief. "Maggie, you need to sit down. I just got off the phone with the FBI agent handling your case. They're dropping all charges." "What? How is that possible?" "Apparently, your father's story about the mine collapse and the diamonds has created a legal precedent nightmare. The diamonds were technically stolen from Henderson Mining Company, but the company knew about the geological formation and failed to disclose it to workers, which violates federal mining safety regulations. Plus, your father's medical condition created a life-threatening emergency that justified any insurance irregularities. Jennifer's voice carried the excitement of someone who'd just witnessed justice prevail against impossible odds. The prosecutor says pursuing fraud charges against someone who committed insurance irregularities to save a father who was literally carrying stolen treasure for her education would be a public relations disaster. And my medical license? Suspended pending review, but the board is fast-tracking your reinstatement hearing for next week. With criminal charges dropped and the unique circumstances, Maggie, I think you're going to be okay. As Maggie hung up the phone, she looked at her father sleeping peacefully for the first time in decades, his face finally free from the grotesque growths that had hidden his identity for 40 years. The man who'd raised her had been carrying not just diamonds in his body, but the weight of loving someone so much that physical transformation became acceptable collateral damage. Some treasures, she realized, were worth more than money, and some sacrifices created wealth that couldn't be measured in carats or dollars, but in the unbreakable bonds between parents and children who refused to let each other face the darkness alone. March arrived in Kentucky with the kind of soft green promise that made Maggie understand why her father had never wanted to leave these mountains. She stood on the porch of the small house they'd rented in Lexington, close enough to the medical center for Bill's follow-up appointments, far enough from Boston to let them both heal without the weight of her former life pressing down on them. Bill emerged from the kitchen carrying 2 cups of coffee, moving with the careful deliberation of someone still adjusting to a body that no longer carried 40 years of hidden burden. The surgical scars were healing beautifully, thin white lines that traced across his scalp like a road map of survival. More importantly, he could look in mirrors again without flinching, could meet strangers' eyes without the instinctive head ducking that had become second nature. "Morning, sweetheart," he said, settling into the rocking chair beside hers. "Sleep better last night?" "Much better." "You?" Maggie studied his face, still marveling at how surgery had revealed features she'd forgotten, the strong jawline that matched her own, the laugh lines around his eyes that had been obscured by tumor growth for so long she'd thought they were new. "Like a baby. First time in decades I didn't wake up with a headache." Bill sipped his coffee and gazed out at the mountains that had shaped both their lives. Hard to believe it's been 3 months since all this started. 3 months since the surgery that had saved his life and nearly destroyed hers. 3 months since the diamond revelation that had transformed them from a struggling family into reluctant millionaires. 3 months of learning how to be father and daughter again without the barriers of guilt and geographical distance that had kept them apart for so long. The medical board hearing had taken place in February, a surprisingly brief affair where Maggie's 25 years of exemplary service and the extraordinary circumstances of her father's case had resulted in a formal reprimand and 6 months of supervised practice rather than permanent license revocation. She could return to medicine whenever she was ready, though the Boston hospital position was no longer available. Not because of the scandal, but because Maggie had finally admitted she didn't want it anymore. "I've been thinking about that clinic idea again," Bill said, as if reading her thoughts. "The one your mama always talked about opening. Free medical care for folks who can't afford the fancy hospitals." Maggie smiled, remembering Dorothy's dreams of providing health care to the underserved communities scattered throughout Appalachian Kentucky. The Dorothy Henderson Memorial Clinic. "I like the sound of that. Already talked to Pastor Williams about using the old Methodist church building on Main Street. Been empty since they built the new sanctuary, but it's got good bones. Space for examination rooms, waiting area, maybe even a small surgery suite if we do it right." Bill's voice carried the enthusiasm of a man who'd found purpose beyond survival. Mrs. Thompson thinks we could get volunteers from the nursing program at the community college. The diamond appraisal had been completed in January, confirming Dr. Santos's initial estimates. After professional cutting and certification, the 47 stones had yielded $1.3 million in total value, enough to fund the clinic, pay for Bill's medical expenses, and secure both their futures with money left over for the kind of generosity that had always characterized their family's approach to unexpected blessings. "I want to do something else with part of the money," Maggie said, pulling an envelope from her jacket pocket. "I've been corresponding with the Vietnamese American Community Center in Louisville. They're trying to establish a scholarship fund for adoptees pursuing medical careers." Bill's eyes softened as he read the letter she handed him. "The Dorothy and William Henderson Scholarship for Adopted Children. Maggie, that's—" His voice caught, and she saw him swallow hard before continuing. "Your mama would have loved that. She always said you were proof that families are made with love, not just blood." She was right. And so were you, for 20 years of double shifts to pay for my education. This scholarship is just paying it forward. Maggie reached over and squeezed his hand. "Besides, we'll need good doctors for the clinic. Might as well start training them early." The afternoon brought visitors, Dr. Morrison and his wife arriving with a housewarming gift and updates on the medical center's interest in partnering with their planned clinic. The friendship that had developed between the three of them during Bill's recovery had surprised everyone, built on shared experience and mutual respect that transcended the usual doctor-patient boundaries. "The university is willing to provide residents for rotations," Morrison explained over lunch. "Rural medicine experience is valuable training, and your clinic could offer the kind of comprehensive care these communities desperately need." "What about liability insurance? Malpractice coverage?" Maggie's practical side couldn't quite shut off even when discussing dreams. "That's where the partnership helps. University backing provides legal and financial protection, plus access to specialists when cases require more complex care." Morrison leaned back in his chair, looking every bit the successful surgeon who'd found meaning beyond his own career advancement. "Honestly, Maggie, this could be a model for rural healthcare throughout Appalachia. Other communities are already asking about replicating the program." Bill listened to the medical discussions with the patient attention of someone who'd learned that understanding came through careful observation rather than formal education. When the conversation turned to clinic logistics and patient care protocols, he excused himself to check on dinner preparations, but Maggie could see him processing every detail. Later that evening, after the Morrisons had gone home and the dinner dishes were cleaned, Maggie found Bill in the small study they'd set up for his physical therapy exercises. He was sitting at the desk, carefully writing in the journal he'd maintained throughout his recovery. Not medical notes, but personal reflections on the experience of rebuilding a life after 4 decades of hidden suffering. "What are you writing about tonight?" she asked, settling into the chair across from him. "Gratitude," he said simply, trying to make sense of how something that felt like punishment for so long turned out to be the biggest blessing our family ever received. Maggie watched her father's careful handwriting fill the page with words that would never be published, but mattered more than any medical journal article she'd ever written. "Do you regret it? Any of it? The years of pain, hiding from people, missing out on so much?" Bill set down his pen and looked at her with eyes that held no bitterness, only peace. "Sweetheart, if I had to do it all over again, the mine accident, swallowing those diamonds, 40 years of looking like a monster, I'd do every bit of it the same way. You know why?" "Why?" "Because it led to this moment, to you coming home, to us having time together, to building something that'll help other families long after we're gone." He gestured toward the clinic plans spread across the desk. "Sometimes the longest roads lead to the most beautiful destinations." 6 months later, On a crisp October morning that painted the Kentucky mountains in shades of gold and crimson, the Dorothy Henderson Memorial Clinic opened its doors for the first time. Maggie stood in the main examination room, adjusting the stethoscope around her neck while Bill greeted their first patient, Mrs. Gladys Thompson, who'd driven from Harlan County for the honor of being the clinic's inaugural appointment. "Doc Henderson, Mrs." Thompson said with a smile that crinkled her weathered face. "I've been bragging to everyone in 3 counties about knowing you since you were knee-high to a grasshopper. Never thought I'd see the day when little Maggie would come home to take care of us old folks." "Mrs. Thompson, you're not old. You're experienced," Maggie replied, pulling up the chart on the tablet that represented the clinic's commitment to combining cutting-edge technology with old-fashioned personal care. "Now, let's see what we can do about that arthritis that's been bothering you." Through the examination room window, she could see Bill in the waiting area, sharing stories with other patients while wearing a volunteer badge that identified him as patient advocate and storyteller. His face, finally free from the growths that had hidden his identity for so long, was animated with the kind of joy that came from discovering purpose beyond survival. On the wall behind the reception desk hung a photograph of Dorothy Henderson in her elementary school classroom, surrounded by the children she'd loved and taught. Beneath it, a simple plaque read, "In memory of Dorothy Henderson, who believed every soul deserves a chance to bloom." As Maggie began her examination of Mrs. Thompson, listening to a heart that had weathered 87 years of Appalachian hardship and joy, she realized that some treasures couldn't be measured in carats or dollars. The greatest wealth was found in moments like this, coming home, healing others, and finally understanding that the most valuable inheritances were love, sacrifice, and the courage to transform suffering into service. Outside the clinic windows, the mountains that had shaped generations of her family stretched toward horizons full of possibility, carrying the promise that even the most hidden treasures eventually find their way to light.